Hello and welcome back to my channel. Now let's start this story with the rockers. Initially I had no idea what they were used for, but back in 2004 I thought I'd make a set, hoping I'd get some inspiration. Now I used one as a single sled to haul a load along the ground, and I found it unstable and quite difficult to control. I then tied a pair of rockers to a block of wood to form a sled. That seemed to work okay, and it had a few advantages over a flat bottom sled. It prevented what is known as bottoming out. Now that's when a flat sled climbs up an incline, it tends to get stuck around the front and rear of its runners. It also stopped beaching. Now that's when a sled arrives at the top of an incline, it becomes beached on the centre of its runners. Now one thing I did notice was the weight distribution. The rocker's contact points are near to the load centre. Thus the outer part of the load is counterbalanced, a double fulcrum if you will. So lifting the load in this way would require less effort. Now I thought no more about it for the next 14 years and stored the rockers in my warehouse. Then around August of last year I booked a trip to Egypt. A trip with Ancient World Tours. It was called Artisans and Architects, with Campbell Price as tour leader. A 12-day study trip visiting some beautiful tombs. I wondered if I could fathom out what the rockers were possibly used for and get some feedback off Campbell. At the start of the tour, myself and 12 other tour members were taken to the Mina House Hotel at the base of the Giza Plateau, and I was keen to show him my latest idea on Petrie's rockers. The bar was open and I made a beeline to it. I told him the gins were on me. Now we talked for an hour or so and Campbell seemed fascinated. He suggested that other artefacts buried with the rockers, picks, hoes, rakes and other groundworking tools could have been used to level the surface before the base plate was placed on the floor. Now we arrived at Hatshepsut's temple at Deir al-Bahrain on day 11 of the tour, and Campbell asked me if he thought the machine could climb a set of steps leading up to Hatshepsut's temple. I said I didn't know, but I'll make a model when I get back home and let him know. Prior to Hatshepsut's visit, we were in Amarna visiting the city of Akhenaten, Tel Ariana, to see one of the royal tombs. The tomb was way up in the hills and my leg was playing up, so I decided to stay on the bus. Now Amarna is barren to say the least, no life whatsoever. I was amazed to see my phone was still working and connected to 4G. Now I have an artist friend who lives in Indonesia. I decided to use the time to ask him if he could do an artist impression for me. Now I asked him to include the workers raking and levelling the ground, ready for the bearing plate. Now I must point out, all statues in Egypt have flat backs, at least the ones I've seen. I haven't found one that isn't yet. I wondered if they were flat for a reason. No sooner had the tour started than it was over. I was at the airport waiting in the departure lounge. I went looking for some duty free amongst all the tourist memorabilia. You know what I mean, miniature pyramids, statues, ashtrays, leather goods, etc. Now whilst I was in Egypt, I noticed many of the statues stood in pairs. The Colossus of Memnon, the two gigantic statues of Amenhotep III on the west bank of the Nile, etc. Perhaps they were in pairs for a reason, so I purchased two identical statues, these two boys. I returned home and set about making a set of Hatshepsut stairs. The video shows the machine could indeed climb the stairs using some stela as an aid to the lifting process. The round top of the stela seems to be the perfect shape to do this. Form perhaps follows function here. Now although it worked in principle, I wasn't convinced at the time that this was the final design of the machine. The one thing that still bothered me was the weight distribution. The load was counterbalanced either side of the rockers okay, but the load in between the rockers relied on the length of the wing and the force applied to it. This would be feasible with loads of 2 or 3 tons, but to lift loads of 50 tons or more would be out of the question. I started playing about with the statues and positioning them on the wing in various positions. I soon realised that if you position the statues pointing in the same direction, the load would pivot about the rock on the left. And if you rotated the statues 180 degrees, the balance or equilibrium point was shifted to the right rocker. Now if I could rotate the statues freely, and move the centre of mass up and down the wing, theoretically I could alternate the balance points. A couple of days later I was passing a local charity shop when I spotted a jigsaw and 2 toy spinners. A strange coincidence, because one side of the jigsaw was Matt with outstretched wings representing balance, and the other was Isis standing before Osiris. I wondered, could I use the bearings out of the spinners to help me solve the problem? I set about building a new model. This is a 6-wing Mark II version. The design features of the ball bearing prevented me from using them. They're more for machines with horizontal shafts. What I needed was a couple of thrust bearings. Now, thrust bearings are designed for very heavy vertical loads. I purchased 2 small thrust bearings online and fixed them to either side of the bottom wing. Now when you rotate the statues 180 degrees, the balance points transfers to the right rocker. Now there's a lot going on here. The statue rests on the top wing with the centre of mass resting over the outer rim of the thrust bearing. When the statue is rotated, its mass moves around the outer edge of this thrust bearing. In that way you can alternate the balance points and move it over each rocker. Now this would work fine for statues of 10 tons or so, but I couldn't imagine the Colossus of Memnon, which is an estimated weight of 720 tons, being moved by this method. Presumably the machine would be made of wood. The stress exceeded on the edge of the rocker would be huge. It would be more stable if the load could rest directly over the rocker. Moving on to Mark III. Again I modified the beam, and this time I fixed one of the spinners to the top of the beam and fixed the other beam on top of that. I repeated the experiments up Hatshepsut stairs, but there was no real improvement. What I required was a thrust bearing of sufficient size to rotate over the rocker pivot points beneath. Similar to the artist's impression, so I went online and ordered another thrust bearing, and this time it was about 3 inches wide, and in fact it was this one, in diameter, and passes directly over the rocker pivot points below. This is the 4-wing Mark 3.2. The thrust bearing is centred between the top and bottom wings. The statue's centre of mass rests over the right rocker. It's forced down and swung to the left. The mechanism is in a state of stable balance. Now the principle of moment states that when in equilibrium, the total sum of the anti-clockwise moment is equal to the total sum of the clockwise moment. This principle can be explained by considering 2 people on a seesaw. Now the base plate is moved and the load is repositioned on it. Note, at this point, the load can move in any one of 4 directions: up, down, left and right. In for a penny, in for a pound. I decided to scale up the model to see if it could handle a heavier load. So from this to this bad boy. Now it was December and I thought I could construct a bigger machine over the Christmas period. And this was a big investment for me. The bearing itself cost nearly £300 and the wooden paint and other ancillaries cost about £200, but I was itching to see if it would work. Now these are the various stages of construction. This bearing's 800mm in diameter, and the length of each wing is determined by calculating the centre of gravity or balance point of the object you're going to move. In this case, again, it was a roller carpet, and that was 4 metres long, so the balance point was about 2 metres in. To maintain balance, the length of each wing was therefore 2 metres. Now we fixed the rockers securely to the plank, making sure the pivot point of the rocker was directly under the bearing. I thought I'd give it a coat of paint and make it look a bit more authentic. I did 2 experiments in January of 2019. The first was to see if I could load the carpet onto the machine by lifting one end only. I made an A-frame out of 2 pipes and secured it from a wheel trolley. Now leaving aside the wheel trolley, I'm assuming the A-frame would be a similar method used at the quarry site. Loading went very smoothly and I'm surprised just how easy it was. Next was to make sure the carpet's centre of mass rested near the outer rim of the bearing. This slight offset takes into account the weight of the machine. In fact, for the system to work, the statue must be heavier than the machine. The excess weight is used to lift the weight of the machine. Now in the real world, you would need something to protect the rockers where they come in contact with the ground. In my mind's eye, I could imagine a copper band fixed to the outer rim. So the machine is in balance and it's time to rotate it to the other rocker. Now as you can see, there is some weight carried by me, and I thought at that time by adding a wheel to the end of the wing it would become more stable. I also wondered, is there a modern example of a turntable or thrust burden that could carry a heavy load? This is a photo of a locomotive turntable. The turntable is used to rotate the train onto another track. And these are the bearings or rollers. The bearing plate sits on top of the rollers, and its top plate supports the turntable and the train. Now thrust bearings of this type can support huge loads. Obviously the Egyptians didn't have steel to make bearings, so I went back to the foundations deposits to see if I'd missed anything. In addition to the groundworking tools, there were calcite ointment jars containing cedar resin. They are oddly shaped, some tapered, some round, long and thin. I suspected these were the rollers used to support a turntable. Now I did some more digging on the internet and found a collection of ointment jars described as miniature vases with titles of Hatshepsut and Karnak. I decided to download the photos and cut them out. There seemed to be a pattern where the size of each example increased in size by about 3 millimeters. Perhaps these were a set of rollers that made up a single line in a huge circular bank of rollers. If this was the case, rollers of this side would need to be pivoted in a cage. Now this photo shows a cross section showing the interior of the roller. It looks to me like there's 3 distinct wear layers, A, B and C. This suggests the rollers pivoted about that point. If this is the case, it seems they were re-engineered at least 3 times, or until the walls of the pivot became too thin. I researched modern day bearings, particularly shaped thrust bearings. I was interested to see if there's any bearing out there made of natural wood or stone. I was also interested to find out about the contents of these jars. Recent studies have analysed the contents. The results point to animal fat or vegetable oil mixed with cedar resin and balsam, and some samples containing traces of malachite. I put large bearing in the YouTube search engine and came up with this. It's a huge tapered bearing for a Dutch windmill. It rotates the headstock, turning the sails into the wind. I could see from the photo that each roller was made of wood and pivoted in a cage. This small pivot holds the roller in position. The pivot itself takes none of the weight and is there purely as a guide. Now I contacted the Dutch company Van Das Limited and asked them for some details regarding the bearing design. They were very helpful and sent me plans for the bearing setup. The shape of a roller is determined by its inner diameter and the distance from the axis of rotation. The bearing is tapered because of the effect called differential. Now differential is a difference in turning speed. Like when you have a car turning a corner or going round in a circle, the inner wheels go slower than the outer wheels. Join me in the next video when I show you the connection between Petrie's rockers and Ezekiel's prophecy.